Hi everyone. We're gonna start in a couple of minutes. We are waiting for the last to join us face to face to join the room. Hello. Hello. 听不到。
你要讲吗？你讲不用你讲。
你好，
很响啊。你讲话你听得到？
咱们听得到，我知道在外面咱们听得到，是我想知道如果我可以登的，那算了，我开始，我开始了。
他现在进。
没有。Hello。
这样
如果他说话的，我会听得到的是吗？应该是的。Okay, can everybody hear me? I'm hidden behind you guys. And because of a little technical issue, I'll have to present our guests from behind, from the back room. So welcome everyone, and welcome those who are in the room and those who are online. It is with great pleasure that I'm welcoming virtually Professor Pai Hyungmin to the Micrograph College at Wenzhou-Kean University. So Professor Pai is a key figure in the Korean architectural scene, but more importantly, for promoting the Korean architectural scene at the global level. He did his study in one of the most prestigious Korean institutions, which is Seoul National University, before going to the MIT to do a PhD from the architectural history and theory and criticism, where his dissertation led to a publication which is called The Portfolio and the Diagram, which was published in 2002 at the MIT Press. Back to Korea, Professor Pai became a professor at Seoul National University and got involved in many curatorial project and publication, such as Gwangju Design Biennale, where he was the curator in 2011, and many exhibitions on Korean architecture at the IDES Gallery in Berlin. In 2007, he published Census Plan, the Architecture of Seoul, which I personally consider as one of the best publications on modern and contemporary Korean architecture written in English language. In 2008, he created the Korean Pavilion for the Venice Biennale. And in 2014 again, when he was awarded the Golden Lion for his curatorial work that he did with Cho Min-suk, a Korean architect that the students here at Wenzhou-Kean know well, since we have met him last year at the same time in Wenzhou-Kean University. Professor Pai is currently director for architecture for the Asian Cultural Complex in Gwangju and chair of the Mokchon Architectural Archive and guest curator at the Samsung Museum of Arts. So after Kim In-chul and Cho Min-suk last year in 2019, we are extremely honored to have Pai Hyungmin today talking to us about his work curating Korean architecture here to our students at Wenzhou-Kean University. So now without further ado, Please help me to welcome Professor Pai Hyungmin.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Can everybody hear me and see me?
Yeah.
So, Vincent, am I online? Am I okay?
Yes, we can hear you properly.
Okay, thank you. So I assume that the way you are seeing me is that you have a full screen of my PowerPoint presentation, and then you have a small screen of my extremely handsome face. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me. I wish I could have been on campus with all of you. I am really very, very interested in what you are doing in Wenzhou-Kean University. I hope at some point in the future that I will see everybody in person. But for the time being, we will talk online. And as Vincent introduced to me, I am not an architect. I was trained as an architect, but I became a scholar, a historian, and a critic and a curator. So that's how I introduce myself to everybody, that I have these multiple roles as an intellectual, as a historian, critic, and curator. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is how I went through this process. So the title is a transformation, and it's a kind of a personal journey, my own journey through training as an architect in Korea, studying in the US to become a historian, a scholar, and then coming back to Korea to try and do intellectual work within the Korean condition. And then as I work in the Korean situation, how I come to become a critic, and then how curatorial work, putting up exhibitions becomes a very important part of what I do. And so this personal transformation, this personal journey has occurred in a few decades. Time passes by very quickly, and suddenly what I did when I was a young student, like all of you, has become a kind of history. And so the idea that what one does now, and what the era, what our situation calls us to do, is all a kind of historical process. And if we look at this large history, we have we understand what our situation is right now and how we approach it. Everybody has a different approach to what they do because of their own history, and also because of the history of their own society. For me, this relation between Korea, the United States, and my changing interests. And this talk today comes out of a article that I wrote for Architectural Review about a month ago. And they were interested about talking about criticism at this present moment. And so I wrote a certain piece with my position in mind, the kind of journey that I went through, and how that conditions the kind of things I do. And so there is this, my own journey, which is maybe about half a century or less than that. And then there is, of course, larger periods of time. And so if we really look at the large span of time, of how things have changed throughout human civilization, we understand that we are all now, wherever we are, whether in Korea or in China, around Shanghai, that we are in a really significant, a really important moment of change. And so we are around here, around 2020, we are in the midst of a series of crises, of a fundamental transformation. We understand that we are within a digital revolution, that there are serious issues of the environment, very fundamental issues of climate change, that our economic system is under serious crisis, whether capitalism can maintain our society. These are all very fundamental issues. And so we can say that we are in a period of change that is comparable, that we can compare to maybe the turn of the 19th century, maybe about 150 years ago, when the world was going through modernization, when the revolution, when the technological revolution was mechanical, when we were going through the industrial revolution that began this immense expansion and explosion of growth, of population, of the use of energy that has created our fundamental environmental crisis. So we have this long span of time. And this transformation is unequal. We all know that though the Earth, the whole of Earth is going through this very serious change, that that the way each region around the globe changes is very different. So again, we know that we are in a period where the global distribution of wealth, of the regions of growth and decline is very different. It's very a kind of fundamental shift that we all know, that I think everybody who lives in East Asia understands, that there is a fundamental shift of power and economic growth from the West to the East. And so, you know, you probably have seen this kind of chart from the early 19th century to around the early 21st century, where we see that in the early 19th century, you know, the East Asia was a significant part of economic wealth and political power in the globe. But because the West led the modern process, led modernization in the 19th and 20th century, East Asia declined significantly. Maybe the early 20th century was at its low point, but we see that towards the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, China, East Asia will be equal or have more significant influence than the West. And so we are again in the midst of fundamental change. And so my experience, my personal journey goes through this kind of transformation, where when I was a young student like you, I was in a country that was relatively poor, that was had very little international standing, and that those conditions created a kind of agenda, a personal agenda, but agenda for Korean society and for Korean architecture as well. So you know, I won't disclose how old I am, but I am a bit older than you might think. So we all know the kind of growth pattern that South Korea experienced in the past 50 to 60 years. China has gone through a similar kind of exponential growth after the 1980s or so. And so I lived through this kind of transformation where as a young student, I was born in the early 1960s. I, uh, I went to school in the late 1970s to 80s. And then as I was introduced, I went overseas to study in the US and then came back in the early 1990s back to Korea. And so roughly during this sort of period where when I was a young architecture student and I was studying, the task for Korea, as it had been for a lot of East Asia during this sort of period. And for Korea, you see from 1950 when the Korean War began, it went through a series of dictatorships. And then after the end of the Cold War, we begin a kind of democratic process. And then we go through several economic crises. But throughout this period, there's a kind of consistent growth. And for maybe until this period, you could say, maybe until around the turn of the century, around here, the key task for Korea is to be modern. So the question for Korea, for someone like myself, always the desire, the goal is to become modern. Practically speaking, when you have a society that grows so much, sometimes at certain periods it was like over 10%. Nowadays we are like, now with coronavirus, we are all sort of in the minus stage. But after maybe the global financial crisis, we have entered a very era of slow growth. I think China also is now sort of entering this phase of much lower growth than the height of this period in the 80s to the early 2000s. And so during this period of rapid growth, the question is for architecture, for building, it's because of this rapid growth of population, of urbanization, you have to build a lot very quickly. And this was, of course, the same kind of issue for the West. It just happened to be that the West, to be modern, to build a lot very quickly, came about before the 1950s, from the 19th century to the early 20th century. So this period of having to build a lot, to become modern for the West was during the 19th and early 20th century. For Korea, for China, it comes about later during the sort of latter half of the 20th century. So we are in this period. And so for a young student like me, so I studied architecture and urban design in Seoul in the early 1980s, and we are in a midst of dictatorships. So, you know, there are demonstrations going out on the streets. So as a young student, I would go out and demonstrate, and we barely had any classes. So my professor who taught my architectural studio would come in about 3 times a semester. And so we barely learned anything. So it was a, it was an interesting period. So for someone who's interested in architecture and who wanted to understand what modern architecture is, there's a problem here when you are a young student in Korea trying to learn what architecture is. So, so as a personal experience, probably you really would never understand this because now you are in a different period. Technologically, you are all doing digital studios. You have computers in front of you. You are, you know, learning from the best faculty in the world, and so you might not, you know, really understand what I went through as a young student. But when so this is spring 1980, so it's a bit back. But as a student who was going through the first semester of architecture studio, in the old days, what they would do was they give you like a clean piece of paper, and then you would paste it on your drafting table, and they would give you this this task of drawing these lines. So most people probably don't know what this is. This is a kind of drafting tool where you put ink in, and then you control this knob to adjust the thickness of the line that you're drawing. So you dip it into ink, and then you draw these lines. And so, you know, as a young student, when you first go to architecture school and you're all very, very excited about what you want to learn, and then you go to the studio, and then the teaching assistant, the professor doesn't even show up in class and asks you to draw these lines. And so, you know, as a very, you know, diligent young student, I would sort of draw these lines. But the question kept coming up to me, you know, like, why do I have to draw these lines? What is the purpose of this? Why do I have to draw these lines thin, 0.3 millimeters, 0.5 millimeters, 0.7 millimeters, and then you have to sort of like draw these lines and make these ends very hard and clear. But, you know, as a youngster, you have these questions, why the hell am I doing this? And so I would ask my teaching assistants, when my professor comes by once a month, I would ask him, like, why are we doing this? And of course, they couldn't answer my question. And they would say, you know, why don't ask these stupid questions and just draw and just do as you are told. And this was, of course, very frustrating to me. I was very interested in architecture, and nobody really taught me anything. You know? So after drawing lines, you know, you would have a studio project, you would design a house. And so somehow I made this plan, and then you had to sort of start to draw elevations, design elevation, and I couldn't do it, you know, like I didn't understand how you would create a facade and elevation from a plan. This was also like a mystery to me. And again, I would ask, and nobody told me. It was sort of like a strange mystery how one design. So, and you know, so it was a time it was politically in Korea, it was very unstable. Students were demonstrating in the streets. And so I decided to go to study city planning for my graduate study, because I thought maybe if I went and studied urban design or city planning, maybe that would give me a kind of light towards how to do architecture, to understand what architecture was. And so this was all a kind of desire to become modern, to know something, to understand something, have a logic of architecture, and based on that, do architecture that is good, that is understandable, that can communicate. And so this is sort of an urge, a desire to become modern. And so after going to graduate school, I met a professor who had studied at MIT. And so he led me to be interested in history and theory. So I applied to MIT and got in. And so I was one of these frustrated students. I don't know, maybe the tools of architectural design have changed, but I think even as a teacher, as someone who teaches students in architecture school, I still see, like these young students who are very have a very difficult time doing architecture and doing design and understanding the process of acquiring a discipline. So this is all sort of not an issue solely because of my own situation, but it has a kind of universal condition that was created by modernity. But of course, I didn't understand this at the time. And so I went to the United States and entered this a PhD program in history and theory. And so in that program, I went into these very intellectual seminar situations. And so looking back, I think that two seminars were very important for me. My intellectual sort of influence. I never met Michel Foucault, but one semester I went through all of his readings in a seminar, and he Michel Foucault's sort of thinking influenced me a lot. And then on the other hand, more architecturally, I think it was fall of 1986, I took a seminar on Louis-Kahn, the very important American architect who worked in the latter half of the 20th century. And in that seminar, there was a couple of weeks where we were studying the education of Louis-Kahn. So how Louis-Kahn learned architecture as a student, what he learned, and what kind of influence his education had on his own design work. And so you probably know that Louis-Kahn studied in the 1920s in Philadelphia at a school called University of Pennsylvania, UPenn that you call. And it was one of these American schools that were influenced by the French school called the École des Beaux-Arts. And so the École des Beaux-Arts is a very important school. It still exists in Paris. And you could say that the 19th century to early 20th century, much of Europe and the United States, the pedagogy, the way the schools taught architecture and how architects designed were influenced by the École des Beaux-Arts system. And so for me, what was fascinating about learning about Louis-Kahn's education is that I understood that architecture could be taught, it could be learned, that architecture was a kind of discipline, a system. And so you see this sort of key word here that I have been interested for many decades. And so what I had been yearning about when I was a young student in Seoul was that I was trying to acquire the discipline of architectural design. And the fact that there was nobody actually taught me this discipline. And so it was a kind of system of knowledge, of technique, of how you see things, how you draw things, how you imagine space, how you create it. And so it's a kind of systematic body that is unique to the architectural discipline. And so this was fascinating to me. So I studied this what we call the Beaux-Arts phenomena, and it became my dissertation. And so as my PhD dissertation at MIT, I studied how the French, this Beaux-Arts system dominated the 19th century and up to the early 20th century, but how the system sort of dissolved, how it disintegrated. And now that we have a kind of modern, expensive disciplines of architecture. And that is why, of course, why all of you and myself have this difficulty, this sort of acquiring architectural knowledge of how to design, because after the sort of unified system of architectural design in the latter half of the 20th century till now, architecture becomes this very, very expensive knowledge, and there are a diversity of methodologies, of approach, of materials and technologies. And so instead of this sort of very strict system, kind of very narrow system of knowledge and skills that you have to acquire, it's much more expensive nowadays, and you have students have to decide what kind of path, what kind of interest they have. And after this, the discipline of the Beaux-Arts system dissipates, we have the emergence of what I call the diagram, and of the modern way of doing architectural design. And so this was a very key part of my dissertation. And as Vincent introduced, it became a book that was published at MIT Press. And so you see the book that came out from my dissertation, the portfolio and the diagram, and then it became translated into Korean. So I finished my dissertation in the early 1990s. It took about 10 years to get it out as a book, and then about 10 years to translate into Korean. But this interest in discipline as a kind of system of knowledge is something that continues to be a very important part of my work, of my interest. And so though the architectural discipline changes constantly, and everybody has to adjust to the kind of shifting landscape of knowledge, it is still a very key part of what you are doing now at school, what your professors are trying to do in the educational sort of situation. So this is something that that continues to be part of my interest. But then I finish my PhD studies in the United States, and then I come back to Korea. And in Korea, there is this lack of a critical intellectual work. And so there's a lot of interesting architects and architectural work that is going on, but very few critical work. So very few writing, criticism, history. And so, you know, I'm a young scholar coming back from a prestigious American university. And so everybody sort of thinks that I can write about Korean architecture. That will be this sort of like influential critic who sheds light on what is happening to Korean architecture. But this is very difficult, you know. So I studied. I went to the United States because Korea did not offer me, could not give me the kind of disciplinary framework to study architecture, whether it was design or history. And the situation didn't really change that much in the 1990s when I came back. And so for a long, long time, I was trying to write about Korean architecture, about modern Korean architecture, about contemporary architecture, but I just couldn't do it, you know, because the ideas, the concepts that I had learned at MIT, in the United States, didn't apply to Korean to the work that Korean architects were doing. You know, the key ideas of Western modern architecture, of Western contemporary architecture, the critical language, the concepts wasn't applicable to what Korean architects were doing. And so there was this sort of imbalance, there was sort of this schism between what was happening in Korea and what I had learned as a historian and critic. And also, you know, when you do history, so when I was writing this dissertation, there's an abundance of material. You go to archives, you have a lot of material to go through, you analyze them, you analyze the drawings, all the magazines, the texts, the archive material, and that's how you sort of write out a history. But going back to Korea, you didn't even have an archive of any architect at all. And so for a long time, I couldn't write anything, you know. So this was very difficult. It's literally, I couldn't write. I was commissioned to write a essay for a magazine, but in the middle of of writing, I just couldn't do it. So it was very difficult for a long time. But then what changed for me was this book. So Vincent mentioned this book. It came out in 2007, and it was called The Centrist Plan. And so Mr. Seung Hyo-sang is one of the most important architects working in Korea now. And so this book project came out where I was going to write a commentary about one of his writing, but it sort of like grew and expanded into a book-length monograph of this architect. And so as I was writing, so I wrote this in English deliberately because I wanted it to sort of have a more international readership. And so in the introduction to this book, I sort of laid out the kind of conditions about writing about Korean architecture. So Mr. Seung is about 10 years older than me. So we're similar generation. So as a writer, neither the architect nor the writer can be inserted into a historical or architectural tradition. There is no canonical history, no archive, no strong thesis to argue against. So it's sort of like I have to write in a vacuum peculiar to Korea. And so I thought that what I was doing was creating history. So the moment I wrote something, it created a kind of idea about what Korean architecture is. And so what I did was I borrowed what I had learned from the West. And so there are ideas and concepts and theories that grew out of the Western tradition. And I understood that it did not apply to the Korean tradition. So that you have two very different intellectual traditions. But what I did was I experimented with certain ideas from the West and asked whether this was relevant to the Korean condition. So this process of questioning and answering and giving sort of temporary answers and conclusions, sort of it created the text and it became the book itself. So for example, in the book, I was questioning the relation between Mr. Sung here and his teacher, who was Mr. Kim Soo-gun is probably the most influential architect of the 20th century in Korea. And so there is this master-disciple relation. And so you try to understand what Mr. Sung learned from Mr. Kim. And so you sort of, one of the questions that I asked was, what is the nature of the wall? This is one of Mr. Sung's representative works. And so you see this very stark facade. And so you ask, how do I read this facade, this flat curtain facade? And so is this wall, is this facade something that you can read like a Western facade, where the facade sort of is a kind of mirror, is a kind of face to the inside? The whole meaning of facade is the face, and the face sort of shows what is inside. And that's a kind of Western tradition. And so when you question what kind of facade does Mr. Sung create, and then you sort of start understanding that in the Western tradition, the most important position is when the viewer sees the building from the front. And so this is the main facade, the main face. But in Korea, the Korean tradition is the most important view is from the inside and looking out. And so there was never really a tradition of the elevation of the front of the main face of the building. And so you ask question then, if there's no tradition of the facade, then how do you read the elevations of a Korean architect like Mr. Sung? And so, when you start asking these questions, you never really arrive at a kind of conclusion. But what you do is you start thinking, you sort of start talking about what is happening, what is different, what is similar, and then you end up with a kind of text, and then you discover things. So why are these things different? Why do they have different attitudes towards the floor, to the wall, to the facade? So for example, if you go towards painting, the tradition, different kinds of painting. So the Western easel painting tradition, where the painting is a kind of vertical surface, and then the painter is using the surface of the paint as a kind of a picture frame. And that is a very different kind of tradition from the Eastern tradition of having the surface of the painting on the floor. And then you're sort of like in your mental, in your imagination, you have visual sort of images that you put on the surface of your painting. And so it's a very different kind of approach to the surface of the painting. And so while Jackson Pollock sort of sort of putting the surface of the painting on the floor was a very revolutionary moment. This is a very famous painter, Korean modern painter, one of the early people who created abstract painting in Korea. So he's very comfortable putting the surface on the floor. And so you start talking about these differences and how the way of life, living on the floor and those things. And so it's not a kind of conclusion or a theory of Korean architecture, but you start talking about differences, you ask questions, and then you sort of arrive at a text that is readable, that you can think through, that asks questions. And I understood that now, okay, so this process of not rejecting what I studied in the West, what I studied at MIT in the US, but using those concepts and asking questions about Korean architecture, about Korean art, about modern architecture in Korea, and then sort of using that process to create a text that is readable, that is communicable, that creates questions and discussions. So for me, this was very important because now I could write about Korean architecture, and I could talk about what Korean architects were doing. And so this was a very important process, and it learned from the modern tradition of the West. And so when the question about this first question about how to be modern, this was a question that, of course, the West had asked themselves much earlier than we had. Maybe there's a kind of 50-year, 100-year difference. But when a society goes through this rapid modernization, when capitalism is the economic system that dominates all kinds of cultural, political production, then there is a fundamental question about what architecture is, what does art do, what is music, what is culture. And so the West, of course, had built up this kind of theoretical tradition that answered what is modern art, what is modern architecture, what is modernism. And the theoretical direction that the West had developed was the idea of this discipline, of how you would create modern art. And so the most interesting theories, work of criticism that I had read as I grew up as a scholar was this modernist tradition that was interested in defining what modern painting was, defining what modern sculpture was, defining what modern architecture was. And so of course, in art, in the art world, in that modernist tradition, of course, one of the most important people was somebody like Clement Greenberg, who would define what modern painting is. And so, this is a famous paragraph from his 1960 modernist painting. And it talks about the essence of modernism. What is it? And so you see this word coming up again. It is the discipline itself. So according to Clement Greenberg, modernism is to define oneself in the essence of what it can do. And so, for example, for painting, Clement Greenberg defines painting as an art form that stresses the flatness of the surface. So for him, flatness alone was unique and exclusive to pictorial art. So he could explain abstract painting, the work that Jackson Pollock did, that Mark Rothko did. So a lot of the work of art that came out of Europe and the United States from the late 19th century throughout the 20th century could be understood by this sort of idea of an internal discipline. So what modernism did was to distinguish the different genres of art. So painting, sculpture, music, literature, architecture. So every genre had its own discipline, had its own logic, and to pursue that logic was to understand the integrity of that field. And so when I was a young student who was trying to understand what architecture was, how to do architecture, I was actually asking that very modernist question, you know. So everything is growing, you know, there's an explosion of building, but, you know, of course, you know, you can build stuff, but is that architecture? Is that good architecture? How, you know, how does one become an architect? Those are the questions that come up when, you know, when you're doing all this kind of stuff. And so that was why these kind of theories were so important and influential at that time. And so as I was studying in the United States and coming back to Korea, so this idea of the discipline still was very important to me. And it was this interest in the discipline was in fact a kind of modernist sort of condition. And this condition sort of created a lot of the industrial divisions, the divisions of our education, the divisions of production. And so all universities, almost all universities, Wenzhou-Kean probably is the same. You have departments of architecture that are different from departments of art and music and design. And so you have these compartmentalizations based on disciplines of art, of how you construct the knowledge. And so this separation of the disciplines is reflected in the way that each genre and discipline sort of developed. So you have literature. So you read a novel by yourself, really. You don't, it's not a communal experience. You are concentrated on reading this novel, and it is a kind of literary experience that is solely created by the text, by the word. So it's a verbal, textual experience. I know maybe some of you are really enthusiastic of hi-fi music. So music that is solely for the musical experience that is solely for the ear. And so you are sort of in this room or in this concert hall, and you're sort of just listening to the sound, to the music. And it's a purely audio experience. And so hi-fi is a kind of experience that encloses music as an independent discipline that is different from painting or sculpture or dance. And so you have these sort of differentiations of the disciplines of the arts. And so as a young student, as a scholar, work like Colin Rowe, who analyzed the formal aspects of architecture, of modern architecture in particularly, was very, very influential to me. And because the writing was so rigorous, you could follow the logic of how somebody like Colin would analyze a building by Le Corbusier, compare it to a building with Palladio, and you could see the kind of formal logic of a building, and was so clear and communicable that you could understand, so this is how architecture is created, how the formal logic of architecture exists. So this was, on the other hand, you were trying to seek something like this in Korean architecture, but it wasn't there. It was a very different kind of tradition. And so this modernist tradition was really a Western construction. So modernism was created by the Western intellectual tradition based on their own artistic production. So it was easel painting, French Impressionism, to abstract painting, to Picasso, to Jackson Pollock, and to Western classical music, Western modern music, Western modern literature, and things like so. So modernism was created by its own sort of work. So it was centered on Europe and America. So no wonder, even if Western, there was influence on East Asia, on Japan, China, it was a very different sort of. So this theoretical construct of modernism was based on a totally different tradition from the East. And so that was, obviously, though this was very interesting, you could learn things, you could learn stuff from this, it didn't really apply to what Korea or China had experienced in the 19th century, early 20th century, not to mention its modern tradition. And then, of course, after the 1960s and 70s, the West went through what we now call a kind of postmodern period, where the Western tradition criticized its own modernist past. So in art, contemporary art began to criticize this modernist construction of the flat surface of art that is confined to this sort of formal rules. And so postmodernism expanded the Western interest in art. You can see these examples of work, feminist art. We have Barbara Kruger's work here, and then intellectually you see that people are now interested in how the Western paradigm, the imperialist approach, created certain conceptions about non-Western societies. And so there was this sort of like expansion of interest beyond the Western tradition when postmodernism began in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond. And so, for example, people began to become interested in non-Western art and culture. So, for example, in the art world, what is called contemporary art, the global contemporary. It began in the 1970s, 80s, and then in the 1990s, there was this explosion of art biennales, and the art market began to expand to non-Western art world, and you see from a Western perspective, they call them new art world. So they suddenly discovered there's this whole world of art that exists, that is interesting beyond European and American boundaries. Of course, the art was always there. It was always very, interesting. But then the West suddenly discovered this and called them new art worlds. And the biennales and the art fairs became a kind of forum, a platform for these to be introduced to a wider audience. Architecture is still never as global as the art world, because architecture, buildings cannot be moved from different places like in the art world, and so it's a much more conservative profession, architecture is, but still the sort of like growing interest in non-Western architecture created sort of different approaches. And so one way of approaching it was this kind of idea of doing global history of architecture. And so textbooks that came out of key Western publishers like Wiley, they were trying to create textbooks that dealt not only with the Western tradition, but the whole world. And I don't know, I know Mark Jasenbeck very well. He's a professor at MIT. We had periods where we studied together. I know him, and I was part of this sort of research group that is still going on, that is trying to research global histories, but it's it's very different. So this is what I think is the attempt from the Western part to create a kind of paradigm that keeps their kind of global outreach, so that the Western influence keeps ongoing, but that they cannot maintain that influence on this kind of centered modernist theory. So this Western Eurocentric theoretical world has collapsed, but is there a new theory, a new kind of intellectual approach that will maintain the influence of so they think that let's do a global history and let's sort of write about everything, everything in the world. And so for me, this kind of approach is represented is symbolically by Kenneth Frampton and his ever-growing textbook on modern architecture. So this is the cover of his most recent edition. I think this is the 5th edition or something. The most it just came out of publication. So it's from Thames and Hudson. It began as, it was called A Critical History of Modern Architecture, and then it continued to go, and recently now he talks about world architecture. And so he deals with everything, like every country. So not only the European, American tradition, but South America, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and so and now you have sort of like South Korea here. I think China also was a recent entry here. And so for me, my response to this this kind of approach is what the fuck is happening here? So I am very, very angry, maybe is the word, or that you have this sort of arrogant approach to the architectures of the world. And so I would want somebody like Ken to just say that I really don't know what's happening. You know, he's very famous, and so he travels around the world. And so he was in Korea for about a week or so. He was in Korea for a week. I guided him for one day, but he visited like different buildings for about 3 or 4 days. And so he suddenly becomes an expert on Korean architecture, and he has a chapter on South Korea in his book. And so this is not the way, I think, to approach this changing landscape of the world when the American, you know, when the Western centric, Eurocentric tradition collapses, which was a kind of modernist tradition. And when you understand that what is happening around the globe has to be sort of communicated, we have to discuss, we have to understand each other, this kind of approach is not the way to do it. A global history is an idea, but how you actually achieve that is something that has a lot of work to do. And so this doesn't mean that someone in my position who was trained in the West, who grew up with the modernist intellectual tools, it's still a very difficult task for someone even based in Korea to talk about Korean architecture in an intelligent way, and to be able to communicate that with people who don't understand, who don't have the experience, but that we can share information and discuss our different ideas. And so what helped me in this process was doing exhibitions. So this sort of process where of studying as a young architect, going to the United States, doing history based on extensive archives in the Western tradition, coming back, becoming a critic of Korean architecture, dealing with the question of how to write about Korean architecture. And then, of course, there are how to move through these kind of limitations that one faces in a kind of Korean condition. And so curatorial work was a very important step in this process of understanding how you can expand the world, how you can approach things that you don't know. And so you can produce things that can expand the range of understanding. And so about the time that I was writing the book on Mr. Seung, I began my sort of like career as a curator. And so I was doing exhibitions for the Venice Biennale. I did, and my experience as a curator grew as the topics expanded beyond traditional architecture to issues of design and the environment. I did architecture on specific architects, Min-seok Cho, mass studies, and now I introduce myself as a curator. So some of the recent work that I done, this was last year, a kind of retrospective of the past 30 years of contemporary Korean architecture. My most recent exhibition that I curated for Seoul Museum of Art on architectural collections. So curating was a very important process for me to arrive at this idea of how to expand, go beyond this modern Eurocentric theory, but without the kind of intellectual tradition, still be able to deal with topics that you don't know that much about, but you are still able to communicate things, create new kinds of ideas and concepts, intellectual horizons. And so the key exhibition for me, the key experience as a curator was the 2014 Venice Biennale. And Rem Koolhaas was the director of Venice Biennale. And for the national pavilions, he gave the theme called Absorbing Modernity here, 1914 to 2014. So he asked the national pavilions to look back at the 100 years of their past and sort of exhibit what they thought was the central aspect of their modernity. And so for Korea, if you give this period time, 1914 to 2014, the central part is 1950, the Korean War. And that was when North Korea and South Korea are divided. And so if you look at the past 100 years of the Korean Peninsula, the key historical situation is this division. And so the earlier part of the 20th century is the colonial period where we are under Japanese rule. And then in 1945, we are liberated. But then in 1950, because of the Cold War, we become two different regimes. And so this exhibition became the first to exhibit both North Korean architecture and South Korean architecture. And so as Vincent introduced me, we won the big prize. We won the Golden Lion. And so you may know Min Seok, who's very happy, obviously, because of the big prize. And I am, sort of giving my talk about how this exhibition came about and things like that. And so when we had this great success of winning the big prize, I sort of thought about why we were received so well, why people thought our exhibition was so good. And my conclusion was that because of Rem's agenda, this looking back at the 100 years, a lot of the exhibitions during this Biennale, the national pavilions, were all very retrospective. They were all looking back at the past. And so it had this kind of historical sort of looking at things that had already been done. And so it was not that exciting. It didn't have this sort of edge of looking towards the future. But because of this instability between North Korea and South Korea, because this was the first situation where North and South Korean architecture was exhibited in the same space, and there was this sort of logic of how we were going to deal with a phenomenon. North Korea is still very difficult to approach. You really don't know what's happening there. We tried to meet architects of North Korea, and we were, there were like situation where we were actually going to meet with them in Beijing, and everything was set up, but then it was canceled, and so it was a very interesting experience because we were dealing with something that we really didn't know anything about. And so if somebody told me to write a book as a scholar about North Korean art, I've never been to North Korea. I've never been to Pyongyang. I think a lot of, maybe if you're Chinese, you can go to Pyongyang. But if you told me to write a book about North Korean architecture, I couldn't write one paragraph. I couldn't write anything. I couldn't do anything because I didn't know anything. But an exhibition allowed you to do things. So you use people who have access to North Korea. You invite certain people through different routes, and then you bring these different things together, put a show, sort of edit a book, and so an exhibition format allows you to do things that you couldn't do as a kind of writer, as a scholar. So uh, the curatorial work sort of expanded what I could do, about things that I didn't really know that much about. And so, there's something wrong here. I was primarily responsible for editing the book. Min-seok was responsible for designing the exhibition, and so we worked very closely together. And so I sort of like brought different intellectual components together, and then Min-seok was designing the space, and then we worked together to sort of link the textual organization with the spatial organization of the show. And it was a extremely interesting process where we were creating a kind of new horizon about the relation between North Korea and South Korea. We compare different ways of reconstruction after the Korean War by juxtaposing different images. As my poster, you could see we had two images of the tallest buildings in the Korean Peninsula during a certain period. So it creates certain images and effects that expands our understanding of both North Korean and South Korean architecture. And this was a very fulfilling sort of experience. And so when I wrote the essay for the exhibition, I confessed, it was called a confession, that in the beginning, I really didn't know anything about North Korean architecture. After more than a year of studying North Korean architecture and doing an exhibition, I still don't know. I confess that I'm still not an expert. And so that's why we called ourselves a crow. So you have a one-eye crow as the image of the curator who is approaching this situation, this condition. And so my confession was that the show was possible not because we knew, we had positive knowledge about North Korea, but we had a kind of spatial curatorial strategy that allowed us to display things, to put things together, and thus sort of like moved along this kind of horizon of intellectual and creative production about this Korean Peninsula. And so this kind of curatorial experience sort of expanded my outlook. And so I was able to move beyond this kind of modernist, Eurocentric modernist tradition that I had been trained with, that my intellectual frame was based on. And the way to move beyond the kind of modernist agenda of trying to understand architecture as a kind of enclosed discipline, as a autonomous discipline, to understand this changing world, from this modern world towards this very, very unstable, this new world where we are facing new kinds of issues. Now the issue is not how to build as much as possible in a very short time, but how to create a kind of sustainable environment. How does this economic crisis that we are going through, how do we create sustainable spatial environments, not just individual buildings, but at an urban scale, at a regional scale, there are new kinds of challenges that we must face, but we don't really quite know how to approach them. We don't have the kind of theoretical tools. And so for me, creating exhibitions has allowed me to approach these issues with a kind of intellectual, theoretical rigor that is not encompassing, not a kind of center theory like what modernism had given us, but it allows you to do things, to be productive, to do interesting things, to do meaningful things. And so recently, a very large exhibition that I had was responsible for. So I was the director of the first Seoul Biennale. So it was a major biennale sponsored by the Seoul metropolitan government, and it was dealing, because it was a biennale on the city, on the issues of the contemporary city. It could not be confined to traditional architecture. And so the issue of how do you create an exhibition in a huge metropolitan city, how does the city become part of an exhibition experience, were the issues that I had to deal with. And the contemporary issues of urbanism had to be at the forefront. And so I was dealing with issues of manufacturing and urban production, of food production, sort of like issues that were beyond the traditional architectural boundaries. And it allowed me to expand my sort of horizon of understanding beyond traditional building and architecture, beyond the modernist theoretical constructs. And so it allows me to expand my experience. So I'm dealing with issues that I'm not an expert in, as I was not an expert on North Korean architecture, but it allows me and to become a kind of intellectual exponent to issues that are very spatial, that are not traditionally architectural, but it has very significant architectural, urban, and spatial consequences. So it's dealing with production of the fashion industry, of garment industry, how these things work spatially, and there are contributions that the architectural community can do with it. So one of the issues was called Production City, a kind of project within the Seoul Biennale, and we're dealing with how urban manufacturing can be sustained in major urban metropolises. And so we're dealing with how people experience the city. So how do you sort of go into the city to create new kinds of experiences, use new technologies. And so to conclude my talk, so we have gone through a kind of transformation. So it is an individual transformation, my own journey from being a young student, where the task was, where the agenda is to be modern, and that I went through our Korean society, went through this kind of process where we had to build a lot in a very short amount of time. We went through this, and this created all sorts of problems, the problems that not only Korea, but a lot of societies experience. These are environmental, political, economical issues. And so you have to change your mindset. You have to change from this modernist mindset that I personally had been trained with, and see the world in a different way, and be productive and contribute, and sort of be an intellectual that can contribute to the issues that we now face. And so I think what happens is that my experience, my trajectory, my journey as a kind of young architect who never practiced, and then I become a historian who has learned how to deal with archives, do rigorous writing, be a critic. So you understand what are the critical tools, what are the theories, the concepts that deals with traditional modern architecture, which is a Western construct, how you use those concepts to deal with architecture from different views, mostly for me, Korean architecture. And then finally, as I'm now doing, you are a curator, you expand your interests, you are dealing now with issues of climate change, of urban production, of environmental issues, issues that are much broader than the architectural, purely architectural concerns. But now, as we already understand, the logic, the theory of architecture cannot be contained in itself. The idea of an architectural discipline was something that was created during this period, during a period of growth. And so you have to sort of adjust, you have to change your approach to what architecture does in society, how it can contribute. So these things for me collapse. And so my experience as a historian, as a critic, and as a curator sort of come together to deal with the myriad of issues that we are now facing. And so, you know, I won't get into the projects that I am dealing with, but the way I am working now, all these sort of experiences in the past, some are very modernist kind of experiences, some are new experience of the new world of technology and environmental issues, but they come together to create a kind of productive horizons that can deal with issues that you don't really know. You know, these are all very, very fundamental questions, but you can sort of deal with them in a very intelligent way, in a way that communicates and develops new and productive relations. So that's my talk today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pei. Um, that was, I don't know if you can hear, but students are very glad. Yeah, that was a great lecture and very enlightening. I hope the students understood everything. Now we'll welcome some questions, either from the room or online through Zoom. You can also ask your questions.
I have a question, Vincent.
Go ahead, Craig.
Thank you so much for really, I think giving your path and sort of also describing kind of the intellectual rigors that and ideas that you're pursuing. Really just great to see. So thank you. I want to know more. I think it's so fascinating that in so many ways it's impossible to bring the two Koreas together, and yet somehow through architecture, you brought them together in some fashion. And I'm wondering if you comment more on that in terms of the geopolitics or the kind of potential of that for the future.
So you are probably talking about the show, the Crow's Eye View.
Yes.
So I think it was, you know, I really don't know where this will eventually take us, because when we were preparing the show itself, politically, we were in a very difficult moment between in the relation between North and South Korea. You know, the will probably people who have followed the relations between North and South understand that it fluctuates extremely. So at one moment you think that we're going to have nuclear war, and then the other moment you think that we're going to have a peace treaty next week. But we've come to understand that this really is very uncertain, that everything that is happening, that we hear from the news, is really very, very so so what I learned, especially with my contact with people who go into North Korea, to go to Pyongyang on a regular basis, is that what we hear in the media isn't it doesn't have any kind of real connection to what is actually happening in North Korea. So even during the early 2018, when there was the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang in South Korea, and then our president was visiting Pyongyang, and he made the speech in Pyongyang Stadium, and everybody was so gung-ho, and we thought that finally peace was coming. He was in Pyongyang there, and he told us, no, this won't happen. You know, this nobody in North Korea actually thinks that something will happen, a fundamental change will happen between North and South Korea. He says that this was really will take a long time, and has to be sort of like fundamental geopolitical, economic conditions that allow us to proceed into a kind of next phase of relations. And so you understand that what you're doing, these sort of little exhibition, and then there's a lot of things happening between North and South Korea, a lot of projects, art projects, ecological projects about the DMZ, collaborations and things like that. But they are sort of like preparations towards a kind of unknown future, and it really is fundamentally unknown. So, you know, the intelligence about what is happening in Korea is very unclear. You know, there was this recent sort of media sort of frenzy about whether Kim Jong-un was still alive or not, and things like that. And so you're constantly surprised about how little we actually know about what is happening, and what the media tells us is sort of like you can't even read between the lines. And so this is, I think, the radical instance of ignorance and uncertainty, which is why, of course, why this Korean Peninsula situation is so exciting to everybody. It has this sort of, it's the next frontier, you know, and a lot of people who study the area understand why Trump is so interested in Pyongyang and Kim Jong-un, because it is, from a real estate aspect, it really is the next frontier. But of course, it's the uncertainty is so huge that you really don't know. But once something happens, it's going to explode and it's going to change the world. And so there is this sort of, I think what Korea is going through is very interesting in that aspect, that there is this huge possibility, geopolitically, economically, a kind of Euro to Eurasian sort of link, East-West. That is all sort of the crucial link is North Korea and South Korea, the key link. But that radical uncertainty, that radical absence of knowledge, of absence of information, is what creates this sort of futuristic, but fundamentally sort of fundamental block of any kind of future prognostication. And so that is sort of like a paradigm of how I think one has to operate intellectually in the Korean condition, and I think it helps, in fact, actually dealing with certain aspects of the unknown. You know, nobody freaks out in South Korea when something politically happens. We are very, very calm, and you know, like everybody thinks that there's going to be war, but we've gone through this so many times, I think. And if nuclear war happens, maybe we're fatalistic, then okay, we all sort of like go together. Uh, uh, and um, and so it sort of, it trains you to deal with uncertainties, how to strategize the thing. So this experience, especially this exhibition, was a really learning experience about how you set up things in conditions of uncertainty and half knowledge, and how do you sort of proceed in an intelligent and productive way under that kind of condition.
Thank you.
Great. I think the students in the room cannot speak, so I will relay their questions. There's in the first slides of the PowerPoint, you are showing the evolution of economy in Korea, and then which basically fits the time where you were studying and then went to the MIT. And then just after, a little bit after, during your lecture, you're explaining how in Korea there were no archive and you had somehow to invent history in order to trace to the evolution, the relationship between contemporary practices and modern practices. And I think it's very interesting. Do you think that, especially a lot of students here, they are living in China, which somehow is following what happened in Korea in terms of growth, but also in terms of post-colonial identity building, especially nowadays in China. And the question from the students was, do you think do you have any knowledge about what's happening in China? Do you think there's anything to be compared between the situation in Korea that you have described and what's happening in China now?
My knowledge of Chinese architecture is very spotty. So I observe with great interest, and I am friends with several Chinese scholars and architects. But my understanding of China is always that that you can't really compare Korea with China. The scale of what we're dealing with China is how many times? At least 10 to 20 times larger in scope, in the kind of civilizational sort of flow of the history of the region, and so if the issue of identity is here, and it is, of course, I understand that the Chinese identity, what we call China, is very, very important now, with all of the with the growing influence of China in the world, and how a kind of nowadays, especially this discussion about whether globalization is declining, this phenomena, and so my take is that I when somebody says that there's a Chinese identity, I am very skeptical about that issue. Is that really an important question in terms particularly of cultural production? And so I think there are a lot of different kinds of China. And of course, already I understand that the culture of Beijing, of the China of the Shanghai, of the and then the Guangdong region, and if you go to inner Mongolia, and so that there is a very different kind of tradition that is going on. And so when we call what is China, and this of course is a very significant aspect, this kind of nationalistic and national political and economic structure that keeps this the whole sort of region together as a unified state. That aspect, and then when we talk about architecture, when we talk about art and culture, I think that has to be sort of distinguished. And I think, for example, nowadays, especially because the United States is now such a kind of interesting phenomena that we observe with a lot of anxiety when we see what is happening with the cultural divide. United States now considered, we now see it was much more divided than we had ever imagined, that the Civil War never actually ended in the United States. Then you understand that, that what we call the national sort of like identity of America, of the United States, is really a very precarious construct. And so I would think that China, but because of its different political structures, would face that question in a very different way, and it will occur within China in different ways. And so I am not an expert. I think Korea is a much more smaller, homogeneous society. Of course, it has to be. It must become more dynamic in its cultural construction to survive the next decades. And so I think the issue of identity, whatever that means now, is a very different construct in China.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to, people are sending me a question on the chat. Yeah, I have a question for myself, which is my own personal question. To you have shown the work that you have done around Sangyo-sang as a kind of starting point to think about its relationship to recent Korean history. Do you have any plan to dig more in this historical vein and work around modern Korean architects in English language, or yeah, this is my own question.
So when I say that my historical work, my curatorial work, and my critical sort of like now all are collapsed together. What it means in daily life is that I'm sort of like scatterbrained. So I have a lot of different projects. Some are writings, scholarly projects, some are curatorial projects, some are research projects, and they sort of like, sometimes they overlap, but of course I try to create a kind of consistent connection between my work as a historian, critic, curator, and researcher. And so that's not easy, as you might imagine. So I continue to study carefully, particularly contemporary Korean architecture, or for example, work by Western architects who do work especially in Korea. So recently, for example, David Chipperfield or Alvaro Siza have done very significant projects in Seoul, and these projects I have the opportunity to study very carefully. And so there are opportunities where you can continue sort of to study the link between the Western tradition, and the Korean sort of architectural process. And so my goal now is to, and there are publication projects, obviously, some are in English, some are in Korean, is to approach as a critic a traditional Korean, a traditional criticism of architectural work, but to try and involve the issues, the larger issues now of climate, of environmental issues, of the questioning of what space means. And so in the work of criticism, that is the challenge, to bring in the new kinds of agenda into the criticism of work. And so the more traditional modernist criticism would involve more formal mechanisms. And there's a lot of things to still talk about in terms of the formal construction of architecture, the material aspects. But then I think the material, especially I think the materiality aspect, especially when digital production, when digital know-how, the relation between fabrication, the global sort of network of building things, the material connection, those are really interesting sort of new connections that we have to understand in Korea, and it sort of makes you understand how, for example, Chinese fabrication know-how is linked to Korean design, and what are the new labor sort of connections. And so I think I continue to study Korean architecture in the way that I studied Seung-Sang, and I do a lot of work with young architects who are using digital technologies, and so that takes me to sort of like new connections that are created, after 2010, and that leads me to new kinds of observations that haven't yet been, I think, published yet, but they'll be coming out very soon in the next couple of years.
Thank you very much. I didn't realize that we actually are almost running for 2 hours now, and I think you should be a bit tired. So first, I would like to thank you so much for your great lecture. I think it was very motivating for a lot of students. And also, I would like to encourage students to have a look on the catalog of the 2014 exhibition that we have in the library. That will give you a better idea of what the curating work of Professor Pai is about. And if you want other books about Korean architecture, you can come to my office. So thank you.
I would really want to do something together in terms of Chinese and Korean architecture. There was a project that was beginning last year where I was working with some people in Beijing, in the Chinese Academy, and we were sort of like creating a show on Asian architecture. But of course, the COVID-19 stopped everything. But but we will return to that project and sort of trying to create an understanding of a larger East Asian sort of horizon. So I look forward to visiting Wenzhou-Kean and visiting everybody, seeing everybody, and to work on specific intellectual and curatorial projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pai, and we're also looking forward to having you on campus once the situation gets a little bit better here. I mean, globally.
But I'm very envious. I see everybody sort of back in campus, so So good luck, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks a lot. Have
Thank you,
have a,
bye.
have a nice evening. I think it's already late in Korea. So have a
Thank you so much.
have a nice
Bye.
evening, and thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you.